11 a.m. sharp. We're going to call this hearing to order. I'm Carlos Bernal. I'm a commissioner and first vice president of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, and it's a pleasure and privilege to welcome you to this hearing number 25 of the 189th regular session of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. The topic is business impacts on human rights and the environment. Before we begin the hearing, I'd like to remind you that the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights is marking its 65th anniversary of work committed to the defense and promotion of human rights due to the common interest and consensus of states and societies to give life to the American Convention and the Democratic Charter. Since 1959, hundreds of professionals have come through this institution, and thousands of individuals, groups and peoples have resorted to the Commission seeking protection, justice, and reparation. I don't want to overwhelm you with too many statistics. We're celebrating the 65th year anniversary with more than 100 country visits, more than 1,000 precautionary measures granted, 750 merits reports, 220 friendly settlements, and 377 cases referred to the court, which is the crux and at the center of the work focused on victims. Now, for individuals with disability, I want to let you know that we intend for this hearing to be as inclusive as possible for persons with any hearing or visual disability, and therefore we request that anyone who speaks at the hearing, that before your presentation, please say your name, your position, and the organization or institution that you represent, so that people with visual disability will know who is actually taking the floor. Likewise, I would like to say, and to the benefit of those who are hearing impaired, that there is closed captioning on your Zoom, and you can also adjust the view of the print, and this is available to anyone who is following us as well on the channels on the social networks of the ICHR. This hearing is about a very important topic, and it needs to be hashed out in the Americas. And a disclosure, part of my education is that I was in Germany, and so I am merciless when it comes to timekeeping. We will be keeping to the time, and I will interrupt you if you go beyond your time. I'm going to give John Jirac, after you all speak for 20 minutes, who's the UN expert on this, and then the Inter-American Commission will have 30 minutes to speak, and then I will give 17 minutes to civil society again, and then the Commission will speak for a maximum of 5 minutes. As you can see, there is a timer up at the top of the screen, and it will begin as each petitioner begins to speak. And so thank you, and I give the floor to civil society to begin. It's time. Thank you very much, Honorable Commission and Rapporteur, for this hearing. Ms. Jimena Reyes of the Federal Organization of Human Rights. We will focus on the situation of human rights defenders in the context of abusive business activities in Latin America, and also on the need for there to be standards that are binding with regard to the obligations of businesses and human rights in the region. We give you the example of Peru, Colombia, Chile, and Brazil. And there is a horrible disconnect between the negative impact of these companies and human rights on the climate, and that these standards are not developed enough. This is being discussed in the UN, a treaty with regard to business and human rights. The Commission has played a leading role in this regard, I apologize, but I will stop the clock for a second. Could you speak a little slower? Because the interpreters can't keep up if you speak that fast. The Latin American companies have played a leadership role in these negotiations in the UN in the final stage to reinforce the macro framework, the legal framework. This involves all countries of the region, also internationally. Since 2017 in Europe, there have been laws of due diligence of businesses in Holland, France, with regard to transnational corporations to prevent and deal with these possible abuses of human rights and of the environment, and with regard to all of their activities. And because this is of an extraterritorial nature, there has to deal with it domestically as well as internationally. But these countries have to develop their own frameworks. In Latin America, there's a huge gap between the criminal laws and civil laws that could regulate the activities of these companies and the impact on rights such as labor rights and environmental rights and due implementation of the laws. This implementation of existing law, this disconnect has to do with the corporate capture of the states, the weakness of public institutions to be able to enforce the law, and the asymmetry of power between the businesses and the people who have been impacted negatively by these activities, and the corporate and the state structure, and where the businesses fit this. And there's been a devastating activities of these foreign companies, and they try to weaken laws, and so states promote policies so that the laws are not sufficiently enforced. In parallel, the existing regulatory frameworks have a lot of gaps and have to be improved. With new regulations, they should take into account the predominantly territorial nature of the abuses. Latin American countries continue to be major exporters of raw materials and the value chain, and they follow extractivist models and laws that include transnational companies' activities are necessary to be put in place. Lastly, it's essential to put into this legal frameworks the transition provisions to not affect climate change or to mitigate it. Now I give my colleague here the floor. Good morning. My name is Leye Subraga, and I'm going to provide information on business and human rights. I'm going to talk about the situation of human rights defenders who try to raise the negative impacts of business in Latin America. And we underscore that human rights defenders who shed light on these impacts is of great concern. In September of 2023, the Center for Information published a report that reveals that between 2015 and December of 2022, there have been at least 1,962 assaults on people and communities protecting human rights in the region. This represents a 42% of the total assaults that are documented by my organization throughout the world, making it the most dangerous region for people who express their concern for the business practices that are harmful to people. This figure is only the tip of the iceberg, because many of the assaults are not documented or reported. These attacks, murder is very extensive, and violence against human rights defenders as well represents 28% of all. Other forms of attacks, death threats, disappearances, and other forms of intimidation. And based on our report, 86% of assaults are focused in Honduras, Mexico, Brazil, Colombia, Peru, and Guatemala. The most dangerous economic sectors for those who defend human rights are mining, agro-industry, renewable energy, wood, forestry, etc., and anything with regard to extraction of natural resources. And the attacks are against people who are defending land and a healthy environment and territories. The groupers that are affected are indigenous, and it's an alarming the number of attacks, 701, and groups who protect land and self-determination and autonomy, the right to free, informed and prior consultation. Many of the assaults involved complicit states and other business and mining organizations and illegal prospectors, mining prospectors, and organized crime groups. And also there's judicial harassment by companies that's of great concern. According to the Center for Information, judicial harassment, it has 3 out of every 4 attacks. There's arrests, arbitrary arrests, on wrongful trials and abuse against public participation, known as SLAPS for its English acronym. And this is of it can be civil, criminal, and administrative, or other types. And their purpose is to silence, intimidate, and silence those who defend. And since 2015, we've documented 100 some odd cases with a characteristic hallmark of these SLAPs. There's dire consequences on human rights, both at the individual and collective level, because these organizations there's economic and psychological costs, and it has a chilling effect with regard to freedom of expression. I give the floor to my colleague. Good morning, Patricia Cruz Marin, del Center for Sahel. Of Sahel. Next, I will talk about some proposals to the Inter-American Commission so that you can address this issue. And this Commission has been putting together its 3rd report on the situation of human rights defenders. We urge the Commission therein to develop hash-out standards to raise the profile of the negative impact of abusive business activities, particularly. It's of vital importance for the Commission to take a stand on the protection of human rights defenders vis-a-vis judicial harassment and the obligations of states to prevent these impacts on with regard to business. And so, additionally, in this report, we urge the Inter-American Commission to consider the serious effect that the judicial harassment have on human rights defenders as a factor that imperils their safety and lives, and to grant them precautionary measures, as the court has also been granting provisional measures. There's been information about the use of SLAPs, and there still has been, the Commission hasn't weighed in on this practice. The Inter-American Commission should. We call on you to develop standards with regard to prohibition of the use of SLAPs by businesses, the obligation to punish any businesses that use this abusive tactic, and strengthen the judicial systems to recognize what SLAPs for what they are and establish proceedings to detect them early and prevent them. The Inter-American Commission can take into account existing anti-SLAP laws, such as in the United States, Canada, Australia, and Thailand, and the European Union's anti-SLAP guidelines as well. We also feel it's essential for you in your report, the Inter-American Commission take into account international standards vis-a-vis threats against human rights defenders, also known as the Protocol of Hope, of La Esperanza, so that states comply with their due diligence duties and punish any threats against human rights defenders. This, as well as other international protocols, have historically been used by courts who deal with the proceedings in these practices of states. They are a roadmap to facilitate investigations to ensure that this is properly tried and prosecuted in line with international standards. Thank you very much. I give the floor to Javier de Peru. Good morning. My name is Javier Mojica, and I'm speaking on behalf of the Center for Public Policies and Human Rights, Peru Equidad. I will talk about the situation of my country briefly. Over the past decades, the Peruvian economy made us a mid-income company with a growth rate that was influenced by international business, but there's a lot of informality and inequality, and there's serious impacts as a result of business activities and social conflicts and damage to the environment and human rights violations, as well as governance and freedom of expression. And there's a lot of impact on people. These extractive industries operate in geographic areas that have expanded widely throughout the territory of Peru over the last decades. In the last 30 years ago, there were 2.2 hectares. Now it's 30 million, not 3.3, and it's a fifth of the national territory where these businesses operate. Another impact is the environmental oil spills on the northern coast. In the north, there is a McDonald's franchise, and it's systematic and violations and abuse against with oil palm trees against indigenous people. The investments are promoted and regulations are made flexible with regard to labor standards and environmental standards, or the oversight is very weak and they cannot impose their punishments, and no accountability with regard to labor laws, and at the same time the administrative mechanisms are ineffective to avoid these negative impacts on human rights by these businesses. To face this, to address this, civil society, we demand businesses to be consistent with their approaches and that the state to take measures to mitigate effectively the adverse impacts related to business activities. Peru approved in June of 2021 its first national action plan about business and human rights, making it possible to strengthen public policies on this subject matter, but without any action, and they've been ineffective when it comes to fulfill these provisions. There's a huge gap remaining, and very little has been achieved. This highlights, as my colleagues have said, the absence of having any regulations to ensure proactive efforts of the state with regard to violations of human rights by businesses, in keeping with UN principles on businesses and human rights, and also with its own standards in the inter-American system, to overcome the inadequacy of the social and environmental government systems, which have not ensured compliance on the part of business to avoid the risks in their activities of violating human rights. I give the Citizen Observatory of Chile, a representative, will speak now. Thank you very much. Good morning. My name is Jose Alwin. I'm from Chile. I'm going to talk about this topic in my country. Chile has one of the economies that has grown the fastest in Latin America, which is supported mostly by exporting of natural resources to global markets. All of this is facilitated by trade agreements in the northern section of the country. There's mining, and there's a lot of foreign companies for decades have exploited this area without any participation or consultation with the Andean peoples who live there, with serious impact on their water and their lands. One of these companies, this Podelco, the state program, has 21 allegations documented of violations of human rights and against the environment and overseas in Chile as well. And so it's been expanding towards the salt mines of the ancestor of the Tacameño and Empoya people to farm and mine there. These countries, they have more than 3 million of pine and eucalyptus, in contrast with the millions of hectares that have been recognized by the state for the Mapuche people in their traditional territories, and the social and environmental impacts of this monoculture farming has created ethnic conflict that's led to more and more violence. In the southern area, the salmon farming areas of both national and foreign ones have had a terrible impact on the labor rights, environmental, and the indigenous people where these are found. The impacts have been documented by the National Institute of Human Rights. And likewise, in other countries, areas of the country, there's not adequate protection framework of human rights in the context of business activities. And this shows that there's been corporate capture of the state, which is manifested by undue influence exerted by companies on legislation, such as in the fisheries law, which was repealed because of their corporate interests. It's also been seen last year in the debate on the draft legislation about health, where there was tried to which would allow companies to not comply with the Supreme Court's decision. Even though since 2017 to date, there's 2 national action plans have been produced with regard to business and human rights. These plans have been weak and they haven't been fully implemented, and therefore they have not changed the context that I've just described. The current government has announced a process to put together a bill on due diligence, but there's important challenges that are posed here. Consultation with the communities who are directly affected by this attractive businesses, and this should be under applicable international standards which go beyond businesses due diligence. There has to be mechanism put in place for it to be enforceable, it all to be enforceable. Thank you very much. I give the floor now to Sandra Tarantino.
Bom dia. Global e do Movimento Nacional de Direitos Humanos, Brasil. Nas últimas décadas, o Brasil tem sido marcado por...
Over the last decades, we have had a policy of development based on economic growth, which has only worsened human rights violations and the harm to the environment caused by this business activity. We see this is a race to the bottom. These are foreign investments that lead to a weakening of laws that protect rights. After 2018, Brazil had its public policies and regulatory frameworks essentially eviscerated, leading to a lack of protection to the environment. Now, broad-scale mining and large infrastructure projects throughout the land are giving rise to conflicts, excluding the participation of those people who are actually affected by these decisions, and jeopardizing the lives and rights of human rights defenders and of the environment. Recently, the green energy projects, such as green hydrogen and wind projects, are also moving forward, and they are following the same pattern of violations. Since 2022, currently, before the Congress, there is a bill of law that did entail broad participation, which addresses the issue of human rights. This law attempts to bind the state and companies through different mandatory obligations to avoid or place front and center people's sufferings, the suffering of people resulting from these different activities. And this is something that runs through the whole value chain. We are eagerly awaiting the passage of this bill of law at the executive level. Recently, a interministerial group was put together to draft the national policy of human rights and businesses by the Ministry of Human Rights and of Citizens. We hope to see effective participation of all of those who are to be affected by this, despite the fact that Brazil has been seeking means to regulate companies. We still haven't done so sufficiently to actually avoid impunity. Now, Braskem, last year in Maceió, which is the capital of the state of Alagoas, destroyed 5 neighborhoods, and more than 55,000 people were evacuated. This resulted from the collapse of a pool of tailings of mining activity, and so there needs to be a binding law running the activities of these companies. Laws and other regulatory means have to be passed to ensure the effective participation of those people affected in the decision-making process, as well as ensuring they have access to information, that there be free, informed, and prior consent assured, with a focus on the right to life and the integrity of human rights defenders throughout the land, that the right to justice be assured, as well as full reparations, including holding responsible and bringing to justice those responsible for these crimes. Thank you. I give the floor to Alejandra Escobar.
I represent here the group of attorneys working in this field. We have been working for decades to restore the situation in this very imbalanced situation in which indigenous peoples, farmers, and other peoples affected by environmental issues have always been hurt, and the very few cases which have been ruled in favor of those peoples are few and far between. Access to justice, by the way, is easier said than done. There is a context all too often of armed conflict, which has been fueled and spurred by the companies themselves, no surprise. The communities keep hoping that they will prevail and that the progress that the inter-American system may offer will be heeded. Not to date, alas. We would wish to have states of emergency launched to show that there is the need for environmental protection. Secondly, it's one thing to consider the environment, it's another to pass the buck and blame those who are not to be blamed. There is a virtually homicidal attitude too often, which is the result of the blindness and the deafness of state agencies. The extractive industry and the imposition of an economic model that is totally against the wishes of the communities has got to be called out. There is aggression against people who act to express their social rights and who wish to protect the environment, and we demand that there be access to justice and a redressing of this imbalance. Judicial interference, the privatization of services, and the carousel, the ongoing circle that benefits one corporate group and then another, simply shows that there is a lack of genuine rights for these communities. This is tantamount to undue influence on their part and on the part of the international and local private interests. For example, the shifting of the flow of one of the rivers in the Guajira. This to boost the open mining, one of the most important open mines in Latin America. And there have been national and international interests here. People have not had a genuine ability to defend themselves, and the rights of the communities have been lost in the shuffle at every stage. Where are the consultation mechanisms? We demand that it should be heeded and that the defenders be given a chance to speak up and to point out the many, many violations that must be recognized. We would hope that there be mechanisms, above all, to recognize and defend the living standards and the ways of living of these communities. Let me give the floor to my colleague. I'm Adela Quijana. I speak here to the International Federation for Human Rights. What you have just heard, ladies and gentlemen, underscores the urgent need for states to take binding measures to harness the unbridled influence of private enterprise to the detriment of the environment. Europe is a source of information. The European legislations are very much more advanced than we are in the Indo-American system. But we need here to uphold comprehensive reparations, help to the victims, and precautionary measures up front. All of this in the context of human rights and the environment, it goes without saying. More than any one law, there must be an overhaul of the legal system. Where are the present legal voids? There are many, many laws that are supposed to be heeded by enterprise companies that are not. Where is the redressing? Where is the demand for effective compliance with such rules as do exist? Where is access to information? And somebody actually keeping tabs on these companies. The legal framework that has been adopted needs to buttress the role of the state as a custodian, as a guarantor of the rights of the underdogs. There has to be a respect for human rights, prevention of abuse, and not simply due diligence per se. Corporate due diligence, as we know, is being used not as an end in itself, but only when it in fact benefits the corporation. There has to be administrative, penal sanctions and additional punishment when there is deliberate noncompliance. Environmental damage and human rights damages has to be recognized by these companies. There should be a coverage of costs and monetary indemnization, but not only. And finally, it's important that laws and norms strengthen the procedural areas that weigh so much, both in public areas as well as in the corporate area. How about advice and consent? How about the freedom to be informed ex ante and to avoid de facto discrimination on behalf of human rights and not always on behalf of the corporation? I'm giving the floor to my colleague Eduardo next. Thank you. I'm Eduardo Garcia of the Center for Public Policy and Human Rights, Peru Equity. My colleagues have all pointed out that Article 2 of the American Convention on Human Rights states that states must take internal measures when the exercise of freedoms and rights therein contemplated are not buttressed by legislative support. It's important, therefore, that the domestic mechanisms whereby human rights make a difference can, in fact, serve as a grounding for society and not be simply there on paper. Where is the criminal and administrative responsibility? They are back in the 18th and 19th century. There has to be teeth here. There has to be a legal construct that is up to date and that gives personhood not only to the corporations, but be there in terms of contracting or subcontracting, which water all of this down. They go very often to keep the prices very low in conditions that are precarious, to say the least. In the Peruvian mining sector, farming out to third parties is a very classic way to shift the legal liability of the initial contractor. And let me tell you that in those companies to which this is farmed out, there is 3 times fewer people in unions than in the other cases. No surprise. Temporary contracting is another example. 99% of people are hired for the day or for short contracts. We beg the Commission, if you'd be so kind as to give me a couple of minutes more to close. We need a report. We have been working on a report, and we would ask you to look at the present political policies on the American continent with regard to these enterprises, and that there be a means to haul in these companies so that they respect the environment and human rights. There has to be an understanding of and application of existing norms. And such a report must also look at corruption and the capture of undue and illicit goods and gain, as well as the reshifting of the criminal, civil, and administrative liability. We also ask that there be recommendations offered to the member states with regard to the adoption of policies and laws that duly regulate the obligation to prevent and protect, as well as remedy these evils, and that where cases of human rights have been violated by the enterprises, the standards be buttressed and steps be taken so that the companies abide by their rules and human rights. You're out of time, sorry. One sentence, not two. These considerations must be taken into account at the time when the risk for precautionary measures is weighed. Thank you very much. And, says the chair, thanks to all of you for this statement. Let me now give the floor for 8 minutes to the expert on the United Nations. You have the floor.
Esteemed Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, representatives of the civil society organizations, ladies and gentlemen, I'm Jan Harab, the UN representative for human rights of the High Commissioner's Office for Human Rights in South America. The environmental crisis and pollution in Latin America are an existential threat that is affecting enjoyment of human rights. Different actors have had a bearing on this through activities such as extraction on a large scale of fossil fuels, deforestation, plastic production, agrotoxins. Some companies are imperiling a healthy and sustainable and clean environment and violating human rights. So human rights defenders who defend the land and resources, particularly indigenous ones, are frequently victims of judicial harassment or assault. So there's a growing number of judgments and laws establish states' obligations as well as of businesses to take measures to address this crisis. States have the obligation to protect the human rights in the face of possible impacts of business activities. To achieve this, they must take adequate measures to prevent, investigate, punish, and provide reparation for these abuses. Secondly, businesses have the responsibility to respect human rights, including the right to a clean, sustainable, and healthy environment, and not contribute directly to deplorable conditions with negative impacts in their business activities. The business and human rights standards require that the location, ownership, and all the value chain, that there must be an evaluation and identification of mitigation and prevention, etc., of the negative impacts on human rights and the environment. And these are linked directly with any of their operations and every part of it. This translates in due diligence and collaboration and safe climate through programs of zero emissions or promoting energy transition, provided that this transition is fair. And there's something at the crux, an issue at the crux of this. With regard to human rights, and as well as the socioeconomic model, inequality must be addressed. In 2023, our office, together with the International Labor, ILO, produced the Human Rights and Fair Transition. We produced a document to create a fair, equitable, inclusive, and sustainable economy to reduce inequalities and poverty and improve human rights respect, including the right to a healthy environment. However, there's been exacerbation of existing inequality, and during the transition, we cannot build a green economy or a fair transition without taking into account the future of indigenous people that inhabit the territories in Latin America where the crucial minerals are found. Nor can we, and this can adversely affect the traditions and life of these people, nor can we deforest the areas to have massive scale exploitation, which has taken place in many countries. On the contrary, what we have to do is ensure sustainable use of natural resources and respect for the rights of indigenous people and local communities that live together and protect these resources. All of this poses a challenge, but also an opportunity for the states of Latin America and the Caribbean, as well as for the businesses that operate in the region to work together along with human rights defenders to work out appropriate and effective solutions to overcome this crisis. States should consider a smart combination of international and national mechanism and voluntary and mandatory measures that respect human rights on the part of businesses, and also the private sector. Its role can be crucial in seeking a solution to this crisis. So with this mission, UN human rights will continue to partner with all stakeholders to promote our business and human rights standards. We do this through different ways, through the conduct of responsible business conduct. And for the last 5 years, we've been doing this in different countries of the region and through the regional forum about business and human rights. Lastly, we hope that the dialogue at this hearing will deal with something that's fundamental, that human rights should be at the center of this discussion and decision-making, attaching a priority to respect of individuals, groups, and the environment. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your remarks and for keeping to the time. And now I would like to give the floor, 30 minutes total, to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, 30 minutes total. I'm going to begin with José Luis Caballero, the Commissioner. You have the floor. Thank you very much, Chair and Vice President. Good morning to each and every one of you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for the information that you provided us. I thank you, Jan Harab, as well for your participation. I'm thinking about two related issues that have to do with business and human rights as a concern that I want to put on the table for you. Firstly, states to compel them to fulfill their obligations. There's no treaty here. We've talked about a binding treaty with regard to business and human rights. There's no treaty afoot yet, but there's multilateral treaties with regard to trade and other bilateral treaties to promote trade. Have you all laid out best practices with regard to international treaties in labor chapters, environmental chapters? Are there any treaties that you are aware of or conventions that have any requirement of prior consultation beyond the ones we're aware of? Because my take is that perhaps at the crux of all of this, in addition to an international treaty and the obligations of business with regard to human rights, perhaps the trade agreements could be helpful. And the arbitral panels and the dispute resolution mechanisms could be very useful as well to pressure states with regard to investments. This could be used. And secondly, I'd like to ask a question that has to do with what you were talking about access to transparent information, administrative, criminal liability aspects. Have you seen any best practices with regard to this transparency, access to information, accountability with regard in terms of corruption in any of the countries? Some countries have put into place systems for bringing about accountability to combat corruption, a major component of which is the participation of citizens. Civil society can be involved, activists, advocates, etc. Is this healthy? Do you view this as a best practice? How can we have a legal framework put into place in the countries to provide incentives to avoid the incentives for corruption? Because it's extractivists for a long time and they've been there's been corruption and they've been taken advantage of. Thank you very much, Commissioner Caballero. And now I'd like to give the floor to Commissioner Volcan. Commissioner Volcan, you have the floor.
Thank you, President. Thank you, President Bernal. And I greet all of you warmly, and thank you very much for bringing this request and ensuring this hearing on this very important topic. I hear very much the call for international standards and binding treaties, binding laws. But I'd like to echo what my colleague, Commissioner Caballero, has said, that there are already existing mechanisms which, in the interim, that we should bear in mind, which no doubt you have already are aware of, but that there are existing avenues. Commissioner Caballero has mentioned in the field of trade, but there are also in terms of crime, tracing assets. There are, multi-state processes in which some of these very slippages can be addressed. On the more emerging issues of business, the environment, even here there are standards that are being developed in international law, some of them not yet hard, but certainly soft law processes. And it's an opposite moment, I think, for us to bear in mind the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which articulates so very clearly the state's duty to protect breaches and human rights abuses within their jurisdiction, including those committed by businesses. And there are pointed references in these UN Guiding Principles to the obligations of states to ensure that businesses domiciled in their territory or businesses under their jurisdiction respect human rights throughout their operations, which means states not only enacting laws, but enforcing these laws and carrying out adequate oversight to meet their international human rights obligations when they contract with businesses or when they deal with businesses who are providing services within their jurisdiction. So I think already these guiding principles, set the stage very clearly as to the norms that should be governing states in their relations with businesses. In relation to the environment, as we've heard repeatedly, the Inter-American Court, in its advisory opinion some years ago, advisory opinion 23, reinforced the right of a healthy environment as an autonomous right, which is, in their very strong language, fundamental to the existence of humanity. The UN representative spoke about existential threats, and here we see the language of the Inter-American Court mirroring that concern, and then the court calling on states to respect its obligations in relation to life, personal integrity, which gives very specific duties on them. And the court itemized this as avoid causing significant damage, environmental damage, in and outside of their territories, the need to regulate, supervise, and monitor activities, to apply the precautionary principle, and something that we've heard mentioned today, to guarantee the rights to public participation, access to information related to potential environmental harms. So I say this, I I say this to just to reinforce that already already we have standards and guidelines. And I think part of the big problem, as you yourselves have said, is the corporate capture. And so what we have is a situation in which states lack the will or, to enforce these standards already that we know about. So acknowledging that, I wonder if you can, in your time left, if you can perhaps highlight some of the existing gaps, some of the more specific gaps you think that need to address, some of the more glaring gaps. And you've mentioned that European legislation is a model. Perhaps maybe you could highlight for us some of those aspects that might be useful in terms of specifics that states in our region need to pay attention to. From our side, I think the Commission's tools will continue to be useful, raising visibility to these issues as we've done here. And when you engage the system in terms of petitions and cases and precautionary measures, you've raised the very dire situation of human rights defenders who are under threat when they raise this. The Commission, in turn, through its system of cases, giving recommendations, but in urgent situations, issuing precautionary measures can also play a very important role. And of course, as always, the advocacy. So from our side, there are tools, but as well, continuing to monitor with your engagement with the Commission. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Vulcan, for this intervention. Ahora quisiera dar la palabra.
I'd like to give the floor to the rapporteur from the ESCER, Special Rapporteur Javier Palomo. He has the floor. Thank you very much. Chair and Vice President, Commissioner, Executive Secretary, it's a pleasure to be present here at this hearing. Firstly, I'd like to thank the organizations that have requested this hearing and providing us the opportunity to address a critical agenda to the ESCER Special Rapporteurship that we have prioritized, a topic that we have prioritized, and we're going to be issuing a paper, the Inter-American Commission. We're going to provide input, and we hope that it will be approved shortly. I'd like to address three considerations to be as efficient as I can, time-wise. Firstly, I want to reaffirm both the issue of business and human rights in terms specifically with regard to extractive industries, but also as it pertains to agro-industry, agrotoxins. This is part of our 3-year agenda. It's very much front and center in our 3-year agenda. We have a flood of doubts that leap to mind about what's the best thing that can be done when it comes to making proposals. You have put forward proposals, first at having this hearing, and I'd like to deal with some of the ideas you put forward. With regard to dealing with these aspects over the next years, it's not necessary for me, full well that producing information, you can submit it in writing, you can continue to do so for monitoring, etc., about the situation on the ground. As far as actions to take, there's several different options. And you all know that there have existed vis-a-vis initiatives that have not been successful in the universal system. That has been spearheaded by many countries of the region. There's background to this. The Inter-American Convention on the right of the human rights of protection of the human rights of older persons. There's been an intention to bring this issue before the Inter-American Convention and come up with a binding convention, and it's failed in the universal system as well as ours. A binding as far as older, just like with older persons, it may take decades to come up with a binding convention on this topic. I mean, maybe there's only been 10 ratifications of the older persons' rights protection instrument. This is an initiative that we have to think about binding inter-American provisions, legal provisions, because this stagnation we're facing in the universal system is quite clear. Also, I believe that these UN principles that seemed that they were going to be the foundation upon which they could build this binding instrument were robust or are robust, and now it seems that they're a ceiling, not a foundation, to become something binding. And there's been so many software guidelines that have been produced everywhere. Many agencies have generated these kind of soft law. The multilateral agencies have done so. There's a lot of soft law. The Commission itself, the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, with its report on business and human rights and standards and everything, has contributed to this huge corpus of soft law. But my question that I want to pose, what is your take on this? Could you weigh in on this for me? What do you feel about this stagnation period we are mired in to achieve binding instruments? It's such a problem here. We've had 3 thematic hearings on the topic over these years on this, and yet we haven't achieved these binding instruments. Now, okay, that's my first question. My second question is, if it seems to me that we have to place emphasis on efforts in the ESCER, special rapporteurship, and specific recommendations for national statutes or instruments in each country that facilitate the decision-making process or guide the decision-making process in this area as a measure to have national binding legislation, domestic legislation, under inter-American standards or respecting in line with inter-American standards, but of a domestic nature. So I share the need, your concern that there's a need to move forward to have this binding instrument in place internationally, in the international sphere. I share this with you. But also, I'd like to ask about the idea of a report geared towards public policies. I have just worked, I've been working for years in the South on public policies. That's where I come from. So I want to ask you, why are you requesting a report on this? Why are you requesting a report when your argument is more about the binding instruments, legal instruments, when this could be used in shedding light? Yes, it could shed light. With public policies may be fine, but it wouldn't bring us any further down the road when it comes to stronger legal instruments and the enforcement thereof and observance thereof. However, my final comment, as mentioned by Commissioner Caballero not long ago, you mentioned, or I didn't, a reference to the impact of the protection of investments in terms of this whole issue. In view of the fact that in many instances that what happens in our countries, the countries of the region, we face difficulties linked to possible claims in arbitration courts outside of their jurisdiction, dispute settlement bodies, in the face of any claims to avoid following the rules of the game by these businesses who are benefited by these treaties that protect investments, foreign investment. They always are headquartered in places where there's no protection. We know the capitals of those countries, they take advantage of these dispute resolution bodies in other capitals of the country. So do you have any recommendations about how we can deal with these to lead to some specific multilateral dispute resolution mechanisms. I'm sorry, I spoke too much.
The Executive Secretariat of the Commission has the floor. Thank you, Chair, members of this head table, Mr. Rapporteur. Let me begin by expressing our thanks, my thanks, for this hearing. Let me tell you why. Because there's a direct link between this hearing and others that have been held on defenders, on judicial personhoods, on entities and persons to whom we have given precautionary measures in Guatemala and elsewhere. There's a leitmotif here. And the proposals that CIDH has offered with regard to the report that is being written as I speak are all very welcome. Now let me give you a little bit of news. As to ideas, as to concepts, it's important, yes, to focus on the importance of stop thinking of nature as a resource. And rather than a resource, to think of responsibilities first and last, as we do for human rights. And the fact of the matter is we do not always sufficiently weigh, and by the way, this is often mentioned at these hearings, the question of belonging to the territory, on being autochthonous, on having ancestral rights and having been there, as it were, forever, as many indigenous peoples have been in a given tract of land. That's on the one hand. But actually owning that land is a very different thing. And we have spent quite a bit of time weighing up these different elements, and the Inter-American Commission decided that it might be a very good idea to think of a resolution on corruption and human rights. We are beginning to work on it. This is a work in progress. This is not a done deal. It is being hatched, as it were. And we hope to have it in hand by the end of the year. But your ideas, your concepts, above and beyond the resolution per se, will be very welcome. And I think that leitmotif, that guiding thread that goes through the various elements you have offered, owning the land, feeling you belong to it, various levels of activism, etc., and the role of indigenous peoples primarily hurt in their persons and in their ancestral lands. All of those are hugely, hugely critical elements, and we thank you for bringing them forth, because you here recognize precisely that guiding thread, that ongoing list of concerns that the region feels. That guiding thread, that ongoing narrative element that cuts through various different sectors and countries is very, very valuable. And that is what we wish to concentrate on in defending human rights. Thank you very much. I have a very, very few minutes left to offer a couple of comments, but I am not going to have the time to say what I had to say. I would rather give the floor to my colleagues. But I do wish to speak very quickly to 5 points. Firstly, reciprocal agreements on the promotion of investment and free trade agreements. I would like to issue here a public call. What a pity that the missions of the member states are not here. Calling out to the member states to negotiate agreements that have threshold of human rights protection and the environment better. I know that Brazil, for instance, negotiates sterling treaties of this kind. Treaties that protect human rights, that protect the environment, and that is a very good thing indeed. And all of the member countries throughout our continent should do as much. Here, and point 2, allow me to tip my hat briefly to my previous life. I call on constitutional courts, supreme courts, in this hemisphere that have a purview over this kind of treaty so that they take a very, very strict constructionist approach to the letter and the scope of any instruments that speak to these points. When I was on the Colombian court, Law 252 of 2019 was drafted, and I had a hand in doing that, and it has been interpreted into different languages. It spoke to a very, very weak as water commitment with France. So weak that the Constitutional Court said that had better be renegotiated so that the human rights, the rights of the environment, and the indigenous peoples have their respective rights better respected, understood, recognized, and upheld. And that is what I say to you. You should do as much. And as Commissioner Caballero noted, and I would like here also to mention this, let's not forget international arbitration that do go to international investment corporations. You cannot think for 1 minute that on those arbitral panels, the treaty in and of itself is the only instrument that's going to weigh. It's not true. We need to meet with CIDH, for instance, to ensure that CIDH finally understand that, hello, part of the normative framework here does include, like it or not, human rights. And that is going to weigh in the ambit of any controversy that arises on the subject. And let me just mention something fresh out of the oven, as it were. 2 days ago, an arbitral tribunal gave the right to Colombia, ruled for Colombia with the mining central bank case that was contaminating the drinking water. It was a Canadian enterprise, and they were using a trade agreement and asked for protection thereunder. And CIDH ruled historically, I believe, to say that with or without any mention in the treaty, no matter, the pollution of the waterways would have been reason enough per se to stop that agreement. Not allowed. And I think this arbitration is positively historic. This is the first time in history that I can think of that something of this nature was ruled on. The rights of the water. It helped the citizens in Guatemala, but it is unbelievably important, and I needed to mention it here. It's historic. Secondly, let me also say that I completely concur with what many of those who have spoken have stated, and that is that it is no longer enough, as the UN Security Council said at the beginning of the years 2000, no longer enough for enterprises to say, oh, we believe in human rights, and then when you look at their Excel sheet on mitigation, you know what? It ain't necessarily true. And it turns out that in practice, it has not been true. And a good friend of mine who used to work on the expert committee on human rights, Surya Deva, said, and I quote loosely, business is a context, entrepreneurship is a context in which human rights need to be high profile throughout the entire supply chain, from the very bottom to the very top of the entrepreneur's supply chain. Human rights should be first and last in everybody's mind. That should serve as a new paradigm if it needs to be looked at as such. And 13 years later is not too late. It's never too late. We here should certainly, and this is where I'm going, must draw up a set of standards that turn the components of these agreements into something that corporations must recognize and respect. That's where we ought to get. At least that's where I believe we should be going. And finally, and I'd like to have the views of the panel on this, let me simply say I very much agree with the first statement that was made here. Of course, we're talking about the development of normative frameworks domestically. Look at the German law that forces German companies to look at their suppliers, to check to see if any supplier is breaking the basic precepts of human rights. And they better not be relying on that, because the company is going to pay huge fines, and the standing of that company might go down the drain. It's a pity that those are not present, but this is a call, if not a calling out, to those normative and corporate frameworks wherein it must be assumed, and indeed it must be the case, that the state owes that promotion and protection of human rights. But that normative table, framework, doesn't fall out of the sky. It means that farmers, human rights units that should be looked at, indigenous peoples, must be consulted ahead of time. There has to be prior consent. Now, as to the question as to why we don't think of a very deep overhaul of these enterprises, to which Latin American corporations should be obliged to be subject, and might be brought before the Commission so to do. Because very often, as we know, privately, there's a lot that goes on. My fourth point, all of this has to happen in a reasonable context. Goes without saying. Because, like it or not, and regrettably, many of the economies of this continent depends on, frankly, abysmal practice in many of these areas, in the area of energy and other areas. Now, there has to be a view of adjustment that is reasonable, that it can't just be imposed from the top down, like it or not. I do believe, finally, that this Commission has a duty to promote which areas in Latin America mostly need to be protected. What is clear is the indigenous peoples, farmers. That maybe hasn't yet been writ large, but they should be. Protection of data, labor exploitation that, alas, exists, diversity and inclusion that needs to be included in the entrepreneurial context, climate change, and last but not least, investments. Because it could happen that companies think, thank you, everything's great, but it could be that their very investments at the end of the day may be going to areas that are eroding human rights. 8 seconds before the time I had allocated to myself, I will stop there and now give the floor to the panel for their second chance to intervene for 17 minutes total. Thank you.
Javier Mujica sobre la...
Javier Mujica on the question of treaties and individuals. I'd like to speak above and beyond the experience that we have gleaned in Latin America in general and Peru in particular. Let me say the following. We have more than 20 trade agreements with different countries and regions in the world, 4 of which include clauses that focus on promoting and protecting human rights in the labor and environmental contexts. This is with the European Union, the UK, Canada, the United States, and a Trans-Pacific Agreement. These include different types of obligations. The obligation to have internal standards that are respected by treaty. The need to effectively respect these norms, not only in name only or on paper, but in practice, and also to focus on backsliding that needs to be avoided when one is seeking to obtain advantages at the expense of the environment and society. But as happens, the European Union in Article 1, as you may know, states forth that the respect for human rights and the rule of law and democratic principles have to be the end game, the final objectives of the treaty. And in Title IX, there is a specific reference to environmental and labor laws, which is a limitation. Now, in some places, there were complaints. The European Union spoke out, and partners in Peru spoke out and agreed that these trade agreements were overreaching, and there had to be measures to redress practices in Peru, labor and environmental. But for all of that, there has been zero result. No results, because where dispute resolution was brought in, the parties were hamstrung in terms of their ability to change policies that went against human rights, again, in the labor or environmental field and in human rights in general. That is not the same, however, with regard to protecting the investments. Peru has subscribed to a number of those treaties protecting investments, and there are some 100 such protocols protecting investment, and that is why Peru is one of the countries on the planet that has been most sued internationally by CIDH. That is ICRD, that's the Inter-American Council on Dispute Resolution, because some of these are considered indirect expropriation of the winnings or earnings that such investments had counted upon. And so the arbitration principles were not guided and are not guided by human rights per se, despite the fact that in Article 56 of the Charter of the United Nations, it is specifically shown that the principal reason is to promote and protect human rights. Article 103 at the very end of the Charter of the United Nations states that the principles of international law and what is established in the UN, if there's one and another, the primacy of human rights shall trump the other. But none of that, alas, is recognized and set forth in different investment agreements. And the case of Colombia that has just been stated, I think, shows a very interesting way forward, a point of great interest, I should say, but which should compel us to, here in the Inter-American system, take a very hard look at what in fact is being decided in the trade area, because the primacy of human rights is not there. On corruption, let me say, it's true that corruption is a very big concern, and there are n number of campaigns that have been launched to that end, to put this forward. You get what you pay for. You get what you pay for, the speaker is trying to say in English. That is very often what is stated. And with regard to companies, you know, there is a very important piece of French legislation that obliges the enterprises to prevent and promote measures against corruption. It can't be by the by it happened. It has to be deliberate. Transparency International has worked on this. And the European legislation includes such legislation, and there's actually, I'm sorry, the interpreter corrects herself, there was a big push for European legislation to include that, but it didn't happen. Hasn't happened yet. And so we're working on this. In terms of the capture of the state of these concepts, through corruption, there's a great deal of kleptocracy, organized crime, and the companies, thick as thieves, on all three counts, I'm sorry to say. Some are fighting for their money, others are buying up companies, and it is, as we know, one of the main sources of communities, of violence against these communities. The rapporteurs in this area and my colleagues know that there's a Latin American norm that we had included in the recommendations we were going to include, but we focused, I think, in my judgment, overly on the report. I think we should go back to the original thought that that element should be included. This is by no means in contradiction, we believe, with working on a report on implementation. But that's not what we need. primarily. We need states that are capable of implementing the principles enshrined. And we think that you, the Commission, should be a catalyst in best practices and also pointing out the loopholes, the weaknesses of these norms. Let me give the floor to Gabriela.
Thank you very much. There's several questions that have cropped up over the last 30 minutes. I'm going to answer just one, the issue about whether we have the UN guiding principles, which have approved, whether it's been sufficient as a framework to state the obligations of states and of businesses. I want to say three things about this. I don't need to say that the obviously they're not binding. They're just a frame of reference. But these principles called on states to take binding measures. That it's not contradictory to create binding instruments. It's not contradictory to these principles, and so it doesn't say it per se explicitly, but it calls on us to take measures to reduce obstacles to justice, standing in the way of achieving justice. And so, and so with regard to guidelines and council and self-regulation and codes of conduct that are based on the guiding principles, they start to acquire a binding effect. And the legislations we've mentioned in Europe, they're based on the understanding that binding measures must be taken. So this process of providing a chance to the guiding principles and that for it to be voluntary, we've already matured, and now it's time. It's mature enough to move on to establishing binding standards. Now, with regard to another question, a report. Say a report that examines laws in the domestic level, as Eduardo mentioned, and I admit it, are enforced in practice of corporate responsibility and different obstacles for practical implementation or enforcement of domestic laws. A lack of access to information, all these things are reasons why there's no enforcement, no practical enforcement of the laws that are in place. And so we need to have measures put into place to dismantle these obstacles, break the log jam, Now, with regard to access to information, I just wanted to measure as to best practices. There are several best practices that we could cite. One of them is the law on due diligence. It's not one of the best examples as far as bolstering measures for businesses, but it's a good example because it grants people who have rights holders access to information. It's the only due diligence law that's in force at this time anywhere in the world that grants expressly those affected by business activities access to information in the context of the activity that's caused harm to them. This is an excellent example. I'm going to stop there, and if there's any time, I'd be happy to answer anything further and let somebody else answer any questions or take the floor. Thank you very much for the questions, and I believe that I'm going to talk about what are the gaps that you were asking about that we find, particularly with regard to understanding the nature of assaults on human rights defenders. One of the major gaps is how to the direct or indirect responsibility of businesses in these assaults. And often we know that the businesses are complicit or in cahoots with the police, or the state is given its acquiescence. But in many contexts, the businesses that are lobbying to promote laws or policies to make it more flexible for them and to stand in the way of freedom of expression. And so what I wanted to begin with is the judicial harassment and how the judicial system is being taken advantage of by businesses that engaging in these slaps. And I want to call to the attention of the Commission. There's trends and how the judiciary is being abusively used by businesses to understand this and develop on the basis therein of standards to prevent businesses from using the judicial system, whether criminal or civil actions against human rights defenders. But we also believe it's important as well to discuss how organized crime, for example, is linked to assaults on human rights defenders in the region, as I was saying, in many of the contexts of drug trafficking, but also in illegal logging. There are murders of human rights defenders. Many have been documented and have taken place, and so investigation, prosecution, and punish those responsibilities is of the utmost importance in terms of human rights defenders. Jose? Thank you. Just briefly, in the interest of time, I just want to reiterate these international trade agreements and the garden variety in Latin America, such as in Chile, which has such a trade, an economy geared toward trade in 60 countries. It has entered into agreements with, and the negative impact of human rights that these agreements have had. It's become very obvious. Javier Mujica has raised this point. The framework agreement between Chile and the European Union, however, has emphasized renewable energy and raw material export, and it's positive on the one hand, but it's a slippery slope as well, because in the southern cone, the demand for lithium is gargantuan. And through these trade agreements, it could facilitate improper exploitation or mining of this mineral. But lastly, I would like to hail what has been stated by hail the willingness of all the commissioner members, particularly, and Mr. Palumo, the special rapporteur, to work on this issue over the next years, because a report, more than establishing standards, we view the report as a first step. It's not the ultimate goal in and of itself, but we are not giving up hope of creating standards and binding standards. We've been waiting in the universal system for a long time, but at least we need information about the issues we brought up with regard to defenders, commercial trade agreements, extraterritorial activities and everything, and business and human rights. And I want to the High Commissioner for Human Rights, I want to congratulate you for taking part, for joining us here, and continue to join in our efforts as you've done elsewhere when it comes to human rights defenders as well. Thank you. There's a minute and 15 seconds. Can I just say something? Yes. Can you all hear me? Because I can't really hear you or see you very well. I don't know. I would like to say that in Brazil there is a draft law that's under afoot which provides a response to one of the main issues in this field, that is accountability.
Então, gostaria só de agradecer.
I know that we're running out of time. I would like to thank you for this participation, for allowing me to speak.
Perfecto.
Great. The Commission has commitments, and so we're going to have to. I'm going to have to close up shop right now and adjourn this hearing. But I'd like to express my gratitude to everybody for the wonderful information, everybody who's taken part of this hearing, your fine ideas, and I hope there to be great progress over the next years. Thank you very much. It is hereby adjourned.
Gracias.